The husband returned home earlier than usual. The apartment was quiet, with only the ticking of the clock on the wall marking the passage of time. He noticed a bag carelessly tossed on the table, keys scattered beside it, and among it all, a thick, neatly bound diary with a bright bookmark. It caught his attention. As he moved closer, he heard the front door of the building slam. Heading to the window, he spotted her, Laura, walking briskly across the yard, not looking back. She seemed tense, as if trying to hide from someone. His gaze fell back on the diary. He had never seen Laura keep a journal before. It was strange that she had left it open like this. Curiosity began to wrestle with a feeling of guilt. The diary was personal, and reading it felt wrong, but something in the situation unsettled him. The bookmark stuck out so provocatively, almost as if it were saying, "Look here." He couldn't resist. Slowly, he picked up the diary, opened it to the bookmarked page, and began to read. "He makes me feel alive. With him, I forget all my problems. We talk about everything I couldn't talk to Kevin about. It's incredible, but when I'm with him, I become a different person. I know this is wrong. I shouldn't feel this way. But every time I think about him, my doubts vanish. He understands me, he sees the real me, and he's always there. Kevin doesn't know anything. He's always been a good husband, but the spark between us has been gone for a long time. I know I shouldn't be doing this, but with Daniel, everything is different. I can't walk away from what he gives me." The husband felt his heart tighten. He turned the page and kept reading. "Today, he told me he can't live without me. I think I can't live without him, either. But what will I do? I can't leave Kevin. He still believes we're happy. I know this will end sooner or later, but I can't stop. I don't want him to know. I can't lose him, but Daniel is too important to me." Each word felt like a blow to his head. He closed the diary, his hands shaking. Not believing what he had just read, he stood up and left the kitchen. The diary remained on the table, a testimony to what he hadn't known. Laura had been hiding an entire world from him, a world where he was no longer needed. The husband flipped through a few more pages, his eyes darting across the lines, trying to process what he had just read. But the more he read, the more this diary revealed something completely unexpected. "Daniel made me feel alive again. I can't explain exactly what's happening with him, but when I'm with him, I forget everything else going on around me. With him, I become a different person, I breathe easier, and that scares me. I shouldn't be thinking about him like this. But every time he's near, I become a different woman. How is it possible that after so many years of marriage, I'm only now realizing that I want something more? Everything that came before seems gray, ordinary, almost empty compared to what I feel with him. I often think about how happy I could be if it weren't for this horrible debt I owe to Kevin. But Daniel, he calls me, and I can't say no. Sometimes, when I look at Kevin, I feel ashamed. I don't know what to do with him. He doesn't deserve this, and I never thought I would become this person. But when I'm with Daniel, I forget who I am and what I'm supposed to be doing. I can't stop." Today, Daniel said he would love me forever. He said with him, I can be myself. When he says that, I feel all my doubts disappear. But then I go back home, and everything falls into place. Kevin, as usual, is in his own world, unaware of what's happening. I don't think he'll ever figure it out. But I can't shake this feeling of guilt. I know I need to stop. Everything I'm doing is a lie. I'm lying to him, to everyone, including myself. But maybe this is what I needed. Maybe I've been looking for this all along, and now I've found it. I don't want him to leave. But I can't stop thinking about him. What will happen if I decide to leave everything behind? What will happen to our family? I don't even know what to do next. In my eyes, Kevin is the best husband anyone could wish for, but why don't I feel that? Why can't I be with him when there's someone else in my life who makes me feel alive? Each word in the diary was like a knife to his heart. He couldn't believe this had been happening right under his nose, that he had been so blind to the fact that his wife wasn't with him, but with someone else. The whole world he had proudly thought of as his own was falling apart before his eyes. He loves me so much. Maybe I love him too. But what will happen if I tell him? I know I can't keep living this lie, but I can't tear myself away from it either. It's stronger than me. The husband felt a lump in his throat. He closed the diary, but it didn't bring him any relief. Everything he had read stayed with him, like a heavy burden that could never be shaken off. The husband again felt how hard it was to breathe, but now it was unbearably important to understand what was happening with his wife, with Laura. She had left that diary, but what else was she hiding? He couldn't let his emotions take over, knowing that right now the most important thing was to observe. The next few days passed like a fog. Kevin tried to maintain the usual atmosphere in the house, pretending that nothing had changed. Laura was oddly silent. Her behavior was unsettling. She often left alone, spent a lot of time on her phone, and her eyes avoided his gaze. But when she was around, she continued to smile and act as if nothing had happened. One evening, as they sat in the kitchen, Kevin noticed how she nervously checked her phone again. She often turned away when he got closer, as if carefully hiding the screen. The moment he entered the room, she quickly shoved the phone into her bag, almost dropping it. Kevin felt his heart tighten. He didn't ask what message she had just read, but now he understood that Laura was hiding something. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. He saw how her hands trembled slightly, how she nervously adjusted a strand of hair. These little details couldn't escape him. She tried to act natural, but Kevin felt that an invisible wall had risen between them. He kept observing her behavior, trying not to reveal what he already knew. She had become more secretive, her habits had changed. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, Kevin saw her glancing at her phone, as if waiting for someone. He continued to think about what he had read in the diary. There was something disturbing in her words, something that shook the ground beneath his feet. He tried to understand how everything had gotten this way, how everything had slipped through his fingers. One evening, when they returned home after dinner with friends, Kevin noticed something strange. Before even entering the apartment, Laura did something odd. He barely heard her quickly pull something from her coat pocket and hurriedly hide it. He moved closer and saw her eyes widen slightly when she realized he had noticed. Laura quickly concealed her phone in her pocket, as if it were something he couldn't be allowed to see. That's when Kevin decided to wait a bit longer. He didn't confront her immediately, knowing that the most important thing now was to gather more information. He sat silently, observing her actions. He saw how she avoided his questions again, how her behavior grew more and more anxious. In those moments, he felt his life gradually slipping out of his control. Laura, the woman he once knew, was becoming more and more unfamiliar. Everything he knew about his family, about their life together, was being questioned. Kevin felt how this uncertainty, these unsaid things, were eating him up from the inside. But he didn't dare accuse her directly. He knew that to understand what was going on, he needed more time. He had to wait for the moment when she couldn't hide the truth any longer. Laura continued to act as if everything was fine, but every glance, every gesture made Kevin feel that she was hiding something important. And he was ready to wait until she revealed everything on her own. "What are you hiding, Laura?" This thought wouldn't leave him, and he knew that sooner or later, he would find out. Kevin could no longer turn a blind eye to what was happening. Every word she said, every look she gave, every small change in her behavior was a signal. He felt her world slipping out from under his feet. But now he needed proof. The time for pretending everything was fine was over. One evening, when Laura was getting ready to leave again, Kevin made his decision. She often left late without explaining where she was going, and he began to suspect that her secrets were hidden in these late-night outings. He told himself that if she left again, he would be ready. That evening, he watched her closely, trying to hide his suspicion behind casual words. "Where are you going?" he asked as she headed for the door, dressed in a black coat. Meeting the girls, she glanced at him briefly, and it seemed like her gaze was just a little too quick to hide the inner tension. "Bye, honey, I won't be late. You rest too." "Okay," he replied, trying to sound normal. But deep down, his anxiety grew. He waited until she left, then quietly got up from the couch. Pretending to get back to work, he dressed slowly, trying not to attract attention. The uncertainty was becoming unbearable, and Kevin knew that if he didn't do this now, he would never be able to calm down. He decided to follow her. As soon as Laura left the apartment, he cautiously stepped out behind her. The evening was dark, and the street was nearly empty. Kevin kept his distance, making sure not to be noticed. He saw her quickly head to a car parked by the curb. As he got closer, he noticed how her face brightened a little. This was the moment when she felt safe, knowing no one could see her. Kevin stopped, hiding behind the corner of a building, and watched. Laura opened the passenger door and got in the car, and the man sitting behind the wheel smiled at her. That smile, light and carefree, immediately unsettled him. He didn't know this man. Why was she so familiar with him? "See you soon," the man said, glancing at Laura over his shoulder as she settled into the seat. Laura smiled back, and the exchange of glances sent a wave of horror through Kevin. He felt how her world was filled with something that felt foreign to him. "See you, everything will be fine," Laura replied, and her voice had such certainty that Kevin felt the ground shift beneath him. He pulled out his phone, quickly taking a few pictures through the window, holding his breath. He knew he needed proof. These photos, these moments would become his weapon, his key to unraveling what was going on in their lives. But his heart was still pounding like crazy. He stood there, watching the car with Laura and the man slowly disappear into the dark night. For a moment, Kevin was left alone, gripping his phone, trying to process what he had just seen. His breath became quick, and his fingers started trembling. Everything he knew about his marriage was crumbling before him. He wasn't ready for this. And yet, he couldn't go back to the way things were. He stood there, processing every second of what had just happened, and then a terrible feeling overwhelmed him. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just a meeting with a friend. This was betrayal. "I'll find out who this man is, and why you're lying to me." These words echoed in his mind like a verdict, and Kevin felt a cold resolve take over him. He could no longer remain in ignorance. He had to find out who this man was, who had taken Laura away from him. He was ready to tear apart this world of lies to understand what was going on. It took several minutes before he returned home. Each step was difficult, and his heart ached at the thought of what he was about to learn. He knew this wasn't just a matter of feelings. He had to act, seek answers, go all the way, even if it led to even more pain. That night, standing in the dark, Kevin understood that this was the moment everything was changing. From now on, he couldn't just sit idly by. He had to expose the truth, and even though it would be painful, he could no longer be blind to what was happening right in front of him. Kevin sat at the table, flipping through the photos he had taken that night. His gaze was fixed on one image where the man behind the wheel appeared unusually calm. But why was this man bothering him so much? He kept returning to the same questions, trying to figure out what exactly Laura was hiding. Kevin's focus grew even sharper when he realized this man played an important role in his wife's life. He was obsessed with finding the truth, and all these sleepless nights only heightened his anxiety. He continued flipping through the photos until he noticed something strange. On one shot, the man in the car was looking over his shoulder. It was odd. It seemed like he knew he was being photographed. Why hadn't Laura told him about him? Kevin's expression grew heavier and more focused. He was sure of one thing. This man wasn't just a casual acquaintance. He had to know more. But what was he supposed to do with this information? He couldn't go on like this, not knowing the truth. When Laura left for work, Kevin felt it was time to take decisive action. He knew she always carried her phone with her, but today it was lying on the kitchen table. This was an opportunity he couldn't miss. He nervously tapped his fingers on the table as he grabbed her phone. He didn't even take a moment to fully consider his actions. Without thinking about the potential consequences, he opened the messaging app. He started scrolling through Laura's conversations. At first, everything seemed normal, standard messages, grocery lists, to-do lists. But as he scrolled down, his eyes stopped on one name, Daniel. He grabbed his head. Who was this person? Why was Laura hiding her conversations with him? Kevin began reading the messages. They were brief, businesslike, almost foreign to her usual way of communicating. Something tightened in his chest. See you tomorrow at the usual time. Thanks for understanding. This helps me cope. A spark of anxiety flared in his mind, and in the next few moments, he realized something was off. The phrases were emotionless, but they lacked the distance that might exist between a client and a therapist. Kevin knew he needed to find out more. He quickly dialed the number from the messages and started searching online. His heart raced when he stumbled upon a social media page. The man he found was the same one he had seen behind the wheel of Laura's car. He was a psychologist. Kevin felt his internal tension rise. But on the other hand, he couldn't just let it go. He remembered the diary entries, full of secrets, doubts, and hidden emotions. Laura had been so careful to hide this fact. Why hadn't she told him she was working with this psychologist? Why had she kept it a secret? A thought flashed through Kevin's mind. Maybe this wasn't just professional help. He couldn't let this situation continue. The next morning, now resolute, he decided to act. He made an appointment with Daniel, using a fake name. All he needed to do was find out who this man really was and what role he played in Laura's life. When he walked into the office, Kevin felt his hands begin to sweat. The small, cozy waiting room smelled of tranquility, but the atmosphere felt foreign to him. He had no idea what to expect. Daniel invited him into the office with a gentle smile, and their eyes met. "Please, have a seat," the psychologist said, motioning to the chair. "How can I help you?" Kevin sat down and began describing a made-up issue: stress at work, depression, fear of failure. Daniel listened attentively, nodding occasionally. His gaze was calm and professional. But then, Kevin realized he needed to take it a step further. He couldn't just sit there and listen. He needed to know something, and he decided to make a risky move. "You know, sometimes I feel like I don't really know the people closest to me," Kevin said, shifting his gaze to Daniel. The psychologist tilted his head, paying attention to his words. "What do you mean?" he asked, maintaining his neutral tone. "My wife, she has secrets," Kevin continued casually. "I recently found out that she's seeing a psychologist, but she hasn't told me about it." Daniel seemed taken aback. His face changed for a moment. His gaze became more tense, but he quickly returned to his usual calm demeanor. "Maybe she feels it's hard to open up to you," he replied gently. "Sometimes people seek support outside their families to understand their inner world." "Maybe," Kevin replied dryly, "but it seems to me she's hiding something bigger." "Why didn't she tell me?" "Everyone has the right to personal space," Daniel said, keeping his professional distance. Sometimes it's necessary to deal with what's inside. Kevin studied his reaction, trying to catch anything that might raise his suspicions. And then, the words that had seemed so calming just moments ago began to sound like evasive justifications. She mentioned you in her diary, Kevin suddenly said, looking at Daniel expectantly. She calls you, the one who knows my sin. The silence in the room became suffocating. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes tightened, and he fell silent. A trace of confusion appeared on his face. I think you should discuss this with your wife, he said finally, trying to maintain his composure. But I can't disclose anything about my clients. Kevin realized he wasn't going to get any more out of him. But one thing was clear, Daniel knew something, and he was hiding it from him. There was an underlying anxiety in his tone. When he left the office, Kevin felt his heart racing. There were no answers, but now his suspicions were only stronger. He understood one thing. Daniel was part of the secret, and Laura was probably hiding far more from him than he could imagine. He felt the tension even as he lay down to sleep. Kevin couldn't sleep all night. His thoughts kept returning to what Daniel had said. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Laura's face, filled with fear and lies. His head was full of questions, and his heart was breaking. He knew he needed to talk to her, but he was afraid that this conversation would destroy everything. The next morning, when Laura returned home from work, Kevin was already ready for the conversation. He was sitting at the table, staring at her with a blank expression. Laura immediately noticed something was wrong, and her eyes filled with concern. Kevin, what happened? She asked, trying to read his face. He stood up, slowly approached her, and stopped a few steps away. Sit down, he said coldly. Laura sat down, feeling her hands start to shake. You told me you had a secret, Laura. Well, I want to know what that secret is. His voice was firm and direct. She went silent, her eyes filling with tears. Kevin saw how she struggled to find the words, but they slipped away. Laura could no longer hide the truth. I can't keep this from you anymore, her voice was barely audible. You're right, it's not as simple as I told you. Kevin moved closer, his face tense. He wasn't sure what he was feeling, pain, disappointment, or anger. You didn't tell me you were seeing a therapist, Laura. You hid that from me, and now you want me to understand everything. His words sounded like an accusation. She looked into his eyes, her gaze full of despair. You're right, I didn't tell you. She paused, gathering her strength. But I wasn't seeing him to deceive you. I didn't want you to know about my past. About what happened before you. Kevin nervously paced the room, his steps becoming faster and more frustrated. What are you hiding from me, Laura? Kevin couldn't hold it in any longer. I need to know the truth, right now. She clenched her fists, trying to find the courage to tell him everything. Before you came into my life, there was someone else. He was cruel, manipulative, and I couldn't get away from him. And when I decided to leave him, I found out I was pregnant. But I couldn't leave the baby, Kevin. I was scared and lost. I didn't know what to do. Her voice trembled with emotion, but she kept going. Kevin stood still, clenching his jaw. His hands were in fists, and his heart was pounding. He couldn't believe he was hearing this from her. You couldn't leave the baby. His voice was hoarse. Do you think that justifies everything you did? Laura was on the verge of tears. She feared that her words would shatter their relationship forever. I didn't know what to do. I left him, but I couldn't leave the baby. I thought you wouldn't understand. I was afraid you would judge me. Her eyes were filled with pain. You're afraid I'll judge you? Kevin repeated, his face twisted with anger. You think I wouldn't understand? Laura, you betrayed me. You hid this from me. All this time, you lied to me, and now you want me to just understand. She bit her lip and took a step toward him, but he pulled away, unwilling to accept her closeness. You don't understand, Kevin, her voice became loud, desperate. I couldn't tell you. I was afraid you'd leave. I didn't want to lose you. I thought if you found out, everything would be over. You thought if you hid it, everything would be fine. His eyes narrowed with rage. You thought you could just cover it up and keep living like nothing changed. Laura stood up, her legs barely holding her. She looked at him, trying to find the right words, but nothing came to mind. I don't know what to say. I didn't know how to explain it. Her voice softened, full of tears. But I didn't want to lose you, Kevin. You mean everything to me. Kevin was silent. He took a few steps around the room, feeling his anger slowly turn into pain. He couldn't separate his feelings from what he had just heard. Laura stood before him, her face twisted in pain, not knowing how to win back his trust. You destroyed us, Laura. His voice was quiet but full of despair. You don't understand how much it hurts that you hid all of this from me. You lied to me and now you want me to forgive you. Laura couldn't hold back her sobs. She stepped forward and took his hand, but he pulled away. I can't keep living with a woman who lies to me. You've destroyed everything we had. His words were like a cold knife piercing her heart. Please, Kevin, don't leave, she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. I love you. You're everything to me. He slowly turned toward the door, his steps heavy, as if with each one, he was leaving part of his soul behind with her. When he walked out, the door closed behind him, and Laura was left alone.